Thanks, David.
No problem.
Yeah. So James, are we deferring to you before we get to the main course?
I think everybody knows who you are, so we're very excited. I'm really interested to learn more about what you've done, but also I don't know if you've integrated this at any point, but I'm curious how since our last hot seat, how your thoughts have kind of evolved on future research too. So maybe at some point you want to speak to that, but you take it away, man. I'm interested.
All right. Well, welcome, Jason. I'm going to defer to Jason on a lot of this. We collaborated, I guess it was 2019 where our worlds collided, and we're going to partially blame Martin for that.
You can blame me entirely, not partially. Right?
Happily.
And we'll defer to Martin in some of this as well, because the initial outreach and the collision was prompted by him. So we're going to defer to him quite a bit. But to answer your question before we jump into this, James, and I'll defer to Jason as well, is that we've had some good discussions, one or two since the last hot seat about how this could evolve. And maybe we'll want to put that caveat out there that, over the next half hour or so, we're going to share these slides with everybody. It's a simple slide deck that takes you through the methodology. Is that if we can get feedback from everybody here as we're discussing potential research going forward, that would be fantastic, as it may offer some guidance about how we can measure a few items. I know there was a couple of colleagues here that discussed how do you measure trust within ecosystems and whatnot. How do we get beyond the rankings that we often see? But maybe you can devote some thought to it and let us know, because we're going to explain how we got to the methodology and how we brought in some data sets to get to where we ended up with Martin's book. So Jason, anything additional on that?
No, other than, it was kind of somewhat of a happy accident where Martin was looking to answer some questions. He had actually put out a very formal research proposal or RFP for research. And I had access to a data set that I thought might have some interesting answers, and was also looking to get a student working on it over the summer. So it just kind of worked out that we were able to dig into the data set a little bit. And I think that there's just a lot of potential. And I think I'll save some of the kind of next step areas to the end. But these initial discussions in the hot seat actually were really interesting in kind of catalyzing some of my thoughts of how to take this project forward and have a little bit more of an impact.
Yeah, well, we have a reveal for you at the end of this slide deck a little bit. But the emphasis probably should be on these next 4 or 5 weeks as we're between holidays and breaks, as it can really start off the new year in a great way to get feedback with some ideas about how we can start really diving into some data. This is supported by the Up Mobility Foundation, the generosity of Martin and company. But this isn't stopping. We're pushing ahead with it. So we kind of look at these next 4 or 5 weeks as a great opportunity to cultivate some ideas, to really start thinking about which data is out there. So if we could put that on everybody's radar, that would be great. So we'll wake up James a little bit. I saw the Zoom yawn there. So we're going to get excited about data right now. So
it's the yawn that comes with having young kids, my friend. That's not enough coffee.
And again, we'll slide the slide deck with you, because we're going to throw a lot at you. Jason alluded to the original research primer and the concept that Martin put out with talent exporting communities and magnet communities. But tucked into that RFP were 3 higher, really overarching themes about these exporting and magnet communities, which were emphasized quite a bit in the book. The macro and the innovation sectors, what are some data sets that really point to this? And this is where the struggle got real from a data side, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And finally, the capital investment in angel investors, since angel always precedes VC in some way, it could be helpful to identify existing data. And that's where it's a little thin, and we're going to get to that in a second. Martin, anything to add? The genesis of the idea, maybe? I know a lot of it was covered in your book, but I just want to make sure that we cover what you outlined for us.
Sorry, I just had to get off mute there. Two things that would perhaps be unusual that people wouldn't notice is that it's unusual that two people from different colleges working together on one project. My hats off to both of you for not just latching on to help do the research, but to collaborate when you were working for different colleges, to collaborate on a single project. It's unusual in the academic world, and I'm grateful to you both for collaborating in that fashion, and it really did help a lot. And that it's continued, that collaboration continues to this day, because we started in this project well over 2 years ago. And from the big picture, the other thing that I'd point out is that those people that are engaged in the startup community already will probably be able to nod their heads and agree with a lot of what's going to be shared here. But what we have a tendency to overlook is that sometimes we're so close to it, and the findings in some way will validate how we already look at things. We overlook how the rest of the community, the rest of the, let's say in this case, upstate New York and other non-tech hub areas completely miss the dynamic elements that we try to bring out in the book and supported by this research on the importance of connections and talent attraction and talent retention. They don't see the connecting threads. And so those of us that are close to it, in the trenches, kind of working with startup community people, we get it because we have the personal experience, but it's having the data to be able to support this ends up being very, very helpful at bringing people outside of our world into a greater understanding, because now it's not just somebody's opinion, but it's objective. And so for that, again, I salute you both for supporting my effort in trying to tell this story for the non-tech community world in a way that helps get their attention and move us closer to the goal of not only creating startup community, but having an impact on local communities everywhere.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, and that's when we get to some of the deeper slides, that's going to come into focus. We don't want to give away too much of the book if you haven't read it yet, but there's these odd linkage links that we'll see depending on where you are in the country. And a lot of it's tied, of course, to upstate New York, but we'll get to that in a second. So moving on, so the research evolution, this is, we kind of looked at it as more of a challenge that Martin presented to us, where there was some really great conversations similar to the ones that we're having here about, what's next? What can we do? Where's really that link? And from a research perspective, that's where when you start pushing one another on ideas, you can see, where does this take us? So what we found on the evolution side is that we still focused on the TMCs, the magnet and the exporting communities, because that seemed to be central to what Martin was asking, challenging us to do. And that's important, moving us forward. And the macro and the innovation sectors was something that we started looking for mostly in the STEM disciplines. And then we talk about data sources in a second, you'll see where that comes into play, especially out of the university setting. But this last point right here ties to our last hot seat, and then I'll defer to Jason on a couple thoughts, is that the tenor of our conversation, or really a lot that came out of that first hot seat when we focused on research, was what can the smaller MSAs do? And when we say MSAs, the metropolitan statistical areas, everyone knows about the big five, but it seems a lot of us that are tied to ecosystems are from smaller regions. What are those next steps? And that's where we kind of found a little more meat, so to speak, on the data side. Jason?
Yeah, and with this, I think that there are a lot of sources of data around companies that are out there. So there are different things that are looking at, targeted, performance of companies like Crunchbase. There's resources for accelerators, but I think there is a resource for startup communities in the Startup Genome Project that has some coverage of this topic. And it's just one that I've come across somewhat recently and is still getting familiar with, but it's really not, it's really looking at almost country level effects rather than some of the regional effects that we looked at here, trying to break things down by MSA, trying to look at specific movement of individuals and things like that. So I think there's a lot of potential in this area to really dive into different regions and really understand how that might lead to startup success.
So the original intention, we covered 2 out of the 3. So that last item there, just to go back to capital investment and the angel investors, as Jason mentioned, there are quite a few resources. We talk about the Crunchbase and the pitch books of the world that really monitor deal flow, right? In terms of any type of investment. On the angel side, there is some data out there, but then we found we really started shifting towards communities. So that third prong right there is where the research and the discussion evolved going forward. So if I could just move folks down. So these are some data sets and some considerations as you start to think of maybe what we're trying to do on the research side of how can we connect some of the data to thoughts. During the last hot seat, there was a lot of discussion about how do you measure trust, in terms of entrepreneurial ecosystems, and to find data sets that align with something that's kind of subjective, more conversations needed, but this is how we arrived at some of the data sets that we got to create some of these models. So I'll kick it back to Jason to discuss the Crunchbase, and then I'll take the bottom 3 about what's publicly available. So the first one is more proprietary data versus the last 3, which are public data sets.
So we use the Crunchbase data set for two ways. One was to try to understand the movement of individuals. And to me, this was the hardest component of it. How do you try to say, what is a talent exporting community and talent producing community? That's a really hard question to ask for the most part. The Crunchbase data set has, a small sample of technologists, CEOs, founders that, and for amongst that group, we have even a smaller sample because of missing data of the number or where they went to school. And so the general foundation or assumption that we had was that by looking at the trends in this sampling of the data of these high value individuals that are founding companies and helping to build them, that we could really understand some of the important metrics that we wanted to provide for the book. So what we did was link the education and the location of whatever company somebody either worked with or founded through Crunchbase. And then for each one of the regions, we looked at all the different companies within those regions and aggregated the funding that came through funding of those companies, either from angel networks or from venture.
Yeah. So the last 3 items they're publicly available data sets, the last 3. So this is a really good point or time to discuss with the group, saying, okay, if you're thinking about really diving into some data and some research, this is the what if slide. If you're trying to prove something, if you're trying to find an answer to something, how can we connect that to data? And this is where we have the Crunchbase data, which was the heavier lift, to Jason's credit, and Anush, which was one of the Rensselaer students that came along for the ride. But the last 3 items really aligned with the public data that we could find connected to. So U.S. Department of Education, we were able to find a very substantial database that focused on which universities were producing X amount of students in certain disciplines. So if you wanted construction management, we could find that, but that wouldn't align here. We were able to identify 5 or 6 STEM related disciplines, and there's about 112. So when you're talking about, it's called dimensionality reduction, we're distilling it down to 6 STEM disciplines, we were able to find it. The quarterly workforce indicators, there was really the focus on startups and are you really creating those jobs? Mind you, this comes back to Martin's book, and the US Census does have a database broken down by region and MSAs, those metropolitan statistical areas, focusing on are they creating those jobs? And then finally, the good old census data, we had to create the MSAs. Everybody knows about New York City and a few other folks. but we wanted to get down to really what we refer to as maybe a smaller region and a smaller market. And you'll see that between the 1 and 2 million in a second. Have you considered using Zoom info or something like that? Not typical. Yeah, that's exactly the thinking that we need. You know, it's like, how can we connect that? So absolutely, James, on that. So we're going to dive into, these are the key variables. We both just touched on them. We're going to distribute these slides later. But Jason, I'll defer to you if there's anything you wanted to add on that Crunchbase item up top.
Yeah, nothing really else. You know, we did look at essentially each degree. So if you got an undergrad degree from RPI and went to grad school at MIT or something like that, you know, we considered both of those as origin schools, and then for each one of those communities as essentially creating the talent. And then from there, we were really just looking at where was the company located in terms of its headquarters. I feel like the time period we looked at up until about 2019, virtual work was a little less common than it is now. I think you get many more startups that are kind of distributed. So I think that creates its own challenge in studying it. But that's also another aspect of, you know, even if the assumption is that, you know, you're located in the location of the headquarters, in reality, you could be located somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's important to note, I think, because the last 20 months, you know, as the concept of work changed, and especially with some of these larger companies looking for talent, this was critical as well, which could definitely lead to another, you know, research path completely, especially with remote work. And items 2, 3, and 4, and we'll distribute this, is a lot of what I explained last slide. I just want to make a mention of the companies that are less than 5 years old, that align with really STEM-based or tech-based companies. We needed a cutoff. So if you're thinking about potential research paths that you want to pitch us and go down that path, do know that especially with data collection, there needs to be a cutoff. So we looked at basically 5 years or younger to define what a startup is. And I make note of that simply because of the last hot seat when we were talking about trust. You know, there has to be a cutoff somewhere, especially with data collection, or it becomes a rabbit hole, so to speak. So a lot of the questions, may want to kick this one back to Martin for this first one. And it was mentioned in our last hot seat, I think, about Moretti's book, which is 8 years old already, The New Geography of Jobs, and may tie into what we've looked at the last 20 months. But maybe kick it back to Martin to explain, you know, what generated a little bit of thought off Moretti's book here.
I think the key item that came out of Moretti's book that has really affected my thinking, not just for the book itself, but it helped coalesce my thinking about even the journey I've been on with Upstate Venture Connect, has to do with the principles of agglomeration, where we know that if you can build up a certain amount of momentum, that momentum then starts to create an effect that is almost like a flywheel effect. And like-minded people attract other like-minded people. And Moretti's book demonstrates that in a very compelling fashion. But you can't argue with the data. And then that set the stage for, well, we know we're not there yet. We don't have that momentum building, but yet Moretti's book also talks about the attributes of an area that are foundational things necessary for creating jobs in the innovation economy. And so we have the attributes, we don't have the momentum. And that's what spurred this research question that I presented to both Jason and Brett. And now you have the outcome. And I can't wait to see where we take this going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, this definitely generated a lot of thought, especially Moretti's book. I remember listening to it when you brought it up and you really emphasized it. But it really generated quite a bit of discussion off of that. And now here we are, you know, almost 8 years later, has that changed? So I think that's good thinking as well in terms of where can this go, from this step forward. And then the last 4 questions focused on really how to connect the engine, so to speak, especially with data. How do we connect the dependent and independent variables? So we looked at a host of variables, everything from median income, median household income, your standard demographic data points, to really the host of data, millions of data points that, or hundreds of variables that Crunchbase offers through a lot of their data sets. And that's again, when we're talking about defining a research question, this could be a rabbit hole. A lot's out there. How can we define it going forward? So what did we find? There's actually some concerns here as well. So for instance, outliers. We didn't look at the big 5. We didn't look at New York, Boston, Seattle. We didn't even look at those MSAs in between, like Pittsburgh, anywhere between 5 and 10 million, or even 2 to 5 million. We dug down a little further to the 1 to 2 million, simply because Buffalo, Cheektowaga, that MSA was there. So was Rochester. And again, because of the connections to upstate New York, I think it was critical just to look at these 19 to 20 MSAs. We also have to take into consideration outliers in every MSA cluster, like San Jose. And we're going to show the results in a second, where San Jose, just really outside of San Francisco, skewed the data quite a bit. So you have to take that in consideration. How did we find TMCs and TECs? Jason touched on that just a little bit ago in terms of those variables. But this is the one that we have to consider. I know that James and David sent some suggestions through chat there, which was great. We also have to consider that there's quite a bit of data lag and scarcity out there. So if you're looking for to answer a research question where it could cook you a steak, ride a bike, and shovel your snow for you, that may be out of reach for now. But there are data sets out there that may connect it. So Jason, anything you want to touch on as kind of the asterisk caveats with research questions here?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Like my steak rare. So I'll kick this to you. This is how you arrived. A lot of heavy lifting on the key calculations on the magnet quotient. But I'll defer to you, sir, on these next steps on the Crunchbase lift.
Yeah, this is just a kind of more of a definition slide of how some of the different calculations were made. We were looking at understanding retainment. So we looked at the number of grads. We looked at the number that stayed from the Crunchbase, based again on the companies that they worked for. And then for the magnet communities, we looked at the number of jobs there were minus the ones that were had stayed, divided by the number of jobs, just to really get at where are people moving to for the startup opportunities, or potentially founding their companies in these regions. It was all kinds of individuals, so not just founders, but founders definitely were a substantial component. I think if I remember right, it was around 30% of the data. But there was a lot of other types of jobs and roles that were part of this. Crunchbase tends to capture many key positions, CTO, CFO, things like that.
This next slide was generated by what can we find? How can we go through all the variables where we try to really find that correlation, that relationship? You have your basic demographic information. We tried to find where the strongest relationships are within this 1 to 2 million MSA. And what we found here is that I'll bring everybody to this side right here, maybe just up top or down here, is that in order to find the correlation, household income, are there good paying jobs? What defines a good job? We looked at this 1 to 2 million MSA, and the one that we found that was super conclusive, that actually showed a strong correlation, was the innovation economy jobs per capita versus the overall number of innovation jobs. And that's where averages always skew data and perception. You hear a lot about, the average number of X or the average number of Y. We're looking at density. which are these ecosystems that are basically thriving on new tech, new startups, and new jobs. And that's where that outlier comes in. In yellow, you'll see that San Jose is definitely a complete outlier. So you have the average innovation jobs that are created, and this was up to 17. So when we talked about that data lag, that was pretty critical. We could probably get 18, maybe 19 since the publication of Martin's book. But that data lag is pretty critical, especially with anything coming from the US government. But still, 7 years is plenty to look at. So when you talk about the innovation jobs created per capita, there is a strong relationship in San Jose. And of course, a lot of that is a spillover effect from San Francisco. In the blue, you'll see that there's 3 MSAs that have created potentially higher averages. So the right-hand column is the average, but the density isn't there. Virginia Beach, Milwaukee, Nashville. But where we really want you to focus on is that purple right there, where there is a strong relationships between the jobs created per capita and the average. So when we talked about some of those MSAs that you really couldn't equate or never really discuss about how it connects to startup economies or ecosystems, Salt Lake City seems to be quite a bit of an outlier because it's not really mentioned when we talk about some of these larger ecosystems. Raleigh, you have the research triangle, and in New Orleans, you may have different economies, and a lot has been made public, especially New Orleans, simply because between hurricanes and really the last decade, it's a region that's been hit kind of hard, but the relocation in terms of southeastern MSAs has been strong. Where the green comes into effect is that there really isn't a strong relationship in those areas. And then you have Tucson, which has low average innovation jobs, and then the per capita. A stronger visual is this. And I want to bring this to your attention because here in the left-hand corner, we have Rochester, Buffalo, Cheektowaga, Niagara Falls, which is clustered as an MSA. On the right-hand side, you have San Jose, off the chart. Raleigh, New Orleans, probably closer to you think in terms of innovation jobs. And this outlier right here is Salt Lake City. So when you talk about a really strong ecosystem based off these variables, is there a relationship, or safe to say a correlation? Salt Lake City is one that we should really focus on. And again, with more data, we could probably update that. But the left-hand side, you have Memphis and Providence, but I just want to spend about 30 seconds focusing right here on Rochester, Buffalo, Birmingham, and Tucson. When we talked about innovation economies and where Buffalo and Rochester were, over the last couple of decades, and I know a lot of the efforts, Martin's efforts, UVC's effort, and a lot of other folks, is how do we bring those MSAs back from left to right here? And I think that's a larger question that does take a lot of time, and it could be a focus of more research. But you can see that the Rochester Buffalo area is now in the same conversation, at least statistically, with Birmingham, Alabama, and Tucson. So when we talk about those odd connections of maybe we haven't thought about it objectively and statistically, there's more connected there than we originally thought. Got a question: the Capital Region not make the grade? Capital Region, Kelly Reardon, is for MSA just below it. So when we talk about Albany, Schenectady, Troy as the MSA, they're shade below 1 million. But that's, that I would say probably 500,000 to 1 million population, I think is maybe where a lot of us fall in, where, let's take a look at it. Absolutely. So Jason, the big reveal, I will turn it over to you, sir.
So the last time we talked, and actually it was during James's hot seat where he was talking about startup communities and the things that they were doing, and it kind of coalesced that, Brett and I have been individually working on some different things. It's still very much a work in progress, but we realized we needed a home for some of these efforts. Brett and I had separately worked on some white papers over the summer with students. We have some students working on both research papers now, as well as hoping to engage some undergrads in the spring, both in some additional data collection and potentially writing to translate some existing research that's already been out there. But what we've done is at least started the process of putting these ideas on a website that could potentially lead to at least additional individuals who might be interested in this topic come together. We're calling it startupcommunities.org. This is going to be the home for, at a start, hopefully after the winter break, the work we've done to date, which involves a number of different white papers again, and a number of different projects that are essentially translating existing research. We've also got some ongoing projects around matching for startups in order to do research at the highest level with startups. You have to be able to do something that's called a counterfactual match, where you have to look at, for example, a startup that had gone through an accelerator and a startup that had not gone through accelerator. So as part of the research we've been doing, we've been trying to create an automated matching process for this. We're working with an individual out at the University of Minnesota who had essentially hand matched thousands of different startups. And so we're trying to essentially replicate her matching process with a deep learning model. And hopefully that will be this platform of research that makes it easier to understand startup success. But while we're going through that process, we want to also potentially try to build in some of the data scraping or other tools that can pull data around startup communities and start to integrate this into this site, so that might be a resource going forward for other individuals that might want to either do research on this area, or the ideal thing would be to have a portion of the site that would be practitioner focused, that might give somebody coming into a startup community an idea of, okay, who are the influencers that are on Twitter that you should follow, that are LinkedIn and know the people in the startup community that you should have. So, or you should have on your radar. So we have hope for this. It's really just a starting point now, but we welcome feedback as we go forward.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so we'll open up to questions, or we'll kick it back to James on the hot seat question.
I'll add a question to kick things off. That's okay. I think we'll just do it as questions. Let's just run it that way. I think we're doing okay on time. One thing that I was curious about as I was looking through this, and I hadn't really thought about before. I always appreciated the somewhat broad definition of innovation economy and innovation economy jobs that Martin included in his book, because it doesn't create such a narrow focus on some of the stereotypical things you might think about in tech, which has frankly only become even more narrowly defined in the past decade. It used to be a lot of, VCs used to invest in a lot of stuff. VCs have becoming increasingly focused on B2B SaaS products over the years, it seems like. But I'm curious how that translates to data for all of you. How do you capture some of these companies that, I think would fit the definition of an innovation economy company, but not be a stereotypical venture capital backed company? In some ways, maybe by the necessity of their region. It becomes, you have this weird sort of situation where most of the companies, for example, that came out of this region that eventually went on to raise venture capital dollars, for the early part of their life had to bootstrap because there wasn't early angel investing. And so they're not going to pop up on Crunchbase the same way. So I'm just sort of curious of your thoughts on, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how to better capture that in data, but you know what I'm saying? I hope that's not too confusing.
I'll take one dimension of it. I think one aspect that I've thought about, I haven't figured out a way to do it, but looking at kind of even the interactions between those multiplier effects of, when you get innovation economy jobs, what additional jobs. And the example I always use for this one is Apprenda. It's hard to really say exactly, this as a catalyst. There are a lot of other things going on, but, when you inject $50 million of venture into Troy, a lot of things start going up. There's more people for restaurants, there's more yoga facilities, there's more, the bookstore suddenly isn't struggling, and, a lot of external benefits. So that's actually on the research timeline or the research plan, to try to start looking at that as, if you have a unicorn style investment that's not typical for a community, how could you, take and compare that with a community that hasn't had that, and see if you can measure the different trajectories, and maybe try to translate that into that multiplier effect of other types of businesses that might not be tech businesses.
Yeah, I wonder. I'm thinking about, to give you another kind of example, I'm thinking about here where I am at Syracuse, or, might be more salient across upstate. When was that? Probably almost 10 years ago, there was a big exit, roughly $1 billion for a company called PPC, which was bought out by Belden. They made all the little cable connectors. That's what they were best known for coax. Essentially kind of unicorn status. They, in some ways, would fit an innovation economy type of company in considering it's a big market and that kind of thing. But they don't have the same kind of community catalyzing event. Like, I haven't seen spin outs from that company. Right? I haven't seen a lot of former employees going out and starting their own thing, or all the types of things that you would expect are the ripple effects of a company, compared to, say, ACV auctions in Buffalo, right? Where you are seeing more of that angel investor activity. You are seeing more of those sort of employees going out and starting their own thing as a result of it. And I don't know how to capture that. You know what I mean? And it seems to be like cultural almost, not just financial success, but like
Right.
there's a cultural piece of that that's really hard to figure out in data.
So James, I'll chip in here with an observation that PPC, obviously a great success financially, but it was definitely more of a traditional business instead of innovation economy. Now, remember, our definition in the book for innovation economy companies includes both the desire to be aiming at at least a national, if not global audience.
Mm-hmm.
PPC did hit that because the reason they got such a big price tag is they had a really big following. All right.
Yep.
And they were successful in getting multi-market expansion, and I believe even internationally. And then, but the second element of the innovation economy definition for a company is something that's based on an innovation. All right. And I'm not sure what PPC had that we would look at as something that was really an innovation on how they did it. They grew the company over a very long period of time through, one could argue, a little bit more traditional approach, and were very successful.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the cultural aspects, a company like an ACV, which shared a lot of equity with their team at every stage of their development, was an underlying factor that resulted in the multiplier effect that you're talking about. So it is hard to tease out who are the innovation economy companies, because the federal and the state data doesn't get into the definition of who has a company that's on an innovation. That's the problem. All right. Much less are they selling to a national or global audience? So the data sets are not out there. That capital raising, which can be identified through Crunchbase, that's a discrete way to get into at least that idea of outside investors are thinking there is a high growth potential based on innovation, is the closest proxy that we can get to that second element of an innovation economy company. That would be my observation, but I'm not a researcher, so I'll let the guys finish off here.
If I could just add, maybe combine Jason and Martin's thoughts there, where I just want to go back to Kelly's question about the capital region. So that MSA also includes Syracuse. So if you're looking at 500,000 to 1 million pop, That's where the CAP region and Syracuse would fall. So I just want to make a mention of that as well. But when we're talking about that multiplier effect, I think that also goes back to Moretti, who focused really on San Francisco, the big five. And now we're trickling down to see, okay, what does scale look like for some of these smaller regions that you won't find in Crunchbase or PitchBook data to connect? So that's something to keep in mind, to the group. What does that look like? Are we talking about 75, spin-off companies, or we're going to look for a dozen and say, hey, this is a great effort, and that takes time as well. The second item is also defining disciplines that are mostly associated with innovation jobs, and that was one of the challenges that we had. And Martin posed the question: is what does an innovation job look like? So the first step is always STEM, anything STEM related. So if you're looking to start an innovative company with some type of innovation, how can you fill that talent pipeline? And since upstate New York for decades really is supported on the education economy, why are we losing so many innovative minds to the big five regions? How do you keep people here? And I think that's an economic development question as well. So when you're looking to match, what's an innovation job from a research perspective, you have to define, what is that? We have to settle on something, and not settle in a way of just saying, hey, we're just settling. It's more of, here are the 6 STEM disciplines that can really fuel it. And that's where we started. So, from a research perspective, it has to be defined. But that means there's also potential going forward of how can we define it and which data are available to define it.
I don't want to dominate the Q&A. I'll open up for others.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I mess up the protocol?
No.
Oh, okay. So I'm wondering, are you guys looking for, there's a lot of correlation, but there's also talk of causation. It sort of kind of makes me reflect on Richard Florida's work, right? Way back, where he showed this massive migration. And then, all these cities came out and said, well, we're just going to create nice parks and attract these people. And then Richard Florida had to go back out and say, no, that was not the point. The point is that those nice parks and gentrification that happened as a result of these people moving to that area, right? People really got the correlation and causation thing severely mixed up, especially numerous economic development agencies, namely ours here. And so, I guess what I'm wondering, I guess that's my root question. I'm trying to understand that. And then 2, I posted something that had always struck me, which is from the Nashville area. Nashville is a hotbed for healthcare startups. So if you click on that, what you're going to see is a family tree. And what they've done is they've linked the creation of every company to every other company in the area. It's a PDF, and I think they post that annually. And so what you can do is literally see the lineage of all the startups in that ecosystem over time. And I think they do that in a causal kind of way to show, but also being part of that family tree does matter in Nashville in terms of where you sit in that family tree. So anyways, I guess to my original question, are you looking for causation with the idea that once you get a handle on that, then you could potentially do it, sort of massage that to make it happen? Is that the idea?
So I can take this first. So first off, the work we've done thus far, for Martin's book and otherwise, has been primarily just looking at trends and correlations and other things like that. So telling a story essentially from data. My goal for the causal analysis is absolutely yes. So causal methods are actually evolving really quickly with different matching techniques. So essentially the way that you do causal data from at least the startup perspective that we're looking at, it's matching a company with another company. And there are a lot of decisions that you have to make for that. So we are trying to do that. But I think that to test different community hypothesis of like X in a community causes Y, the idea is that you're looking for this intervention, and you kind of look at the different communities that had that intervention, and then you try to find a matching community that matches on a lot of different characteristics, but then didn't have that intervention. And so we really haven't started that process of trying to do that matching technique at the community level. We've been mostly looking at it from the startup level, but that's definitely an area of research that we're hoping to do in the future.
Yeah, so then you guys know about the small world stuff, all of that research out there, the small world hypothesis and all the work that was done on the mapping of the Boston communities and the Silicon Valley communities, where they were literally like I think they were using patents and IP, where they were mapping out the networks, and then basically showed that internal policy decisions that were made specifically out in Silicon Valley in terms of sharing, and not just IP, but also people, that as people started to move across these organizations, all these structural holes in the networks collapsed in a pretty rapid manner, suggesting a causation from that sort of sharing that was going on, or the tension at least that was created between the sharing and the protecting of all that stuff. And it just turned into this, what they call the small world, where the community, again, the structural holes disappear and it happens. So I guess that's sort of, I'm wondering how you get away from, or not look at sort of network type stuff to manage this, given how critical it is, where you could abstract it up to a company level. That's one thing, for example, like the family tree from Nashville, but really, especially early days, the fragility of the community is potentially more dependent upon individuals and mindset of those individuals that are involved than other factors, right? You could probably logically get there as a
to touch on that a bit, Mike. I think you mentioned two items that would be helpful for us, or really anybody in the group. It's really the what if scenario. Like, what if we looked at this variable or that variable? And you mentioned patent volume, and that was one of the variables that I think we looked at earlier in the entire research process, to say, can we look at per capita volume of patents as this independent variable that may hit on that small world phenomenon? And there's a little bit of lag there and whatnot. And there's a database, I think, Jason, you shared it with me. You found it was from Darden at UVA, about their tracking volume of patents. And I think that's where it gets exciting from a research perspective, is because it's what we don't know. We know what the big five are doing and what kind of research can be done in Boston or Silicon Valley. It's more of which independent variables can we find to maybe find that causal analysis, which, we're leaning on this group to maybe, throw whatever, let's see what sticks, right? To say, okay, what's this next stage of research and development that we could find? So that thinking is great. You touched on a few independent variables. That is the thinking that we need.
So Brett, here's an idea for a possible variable to take a look at, because patents would be great, but the problem in smaller areas like we have across upstate New York is there's not enough scale to have a lot of patents, all right? And I would suggest probably in other areas as well, where you almost have to have a certain amount of scale for that to move the needle someplace. But R&D investment, which is also tracked, the academic side is the easiest, because the funds that are dispersed, public money into R&D, that data is out there. Corporate R&D is another piece of that. And being able to piece together that combination of corporate R&D and what's done in academic research might be another variable to pin some of this on, in terms of, well, in order for R&D to be going on, there has to be some investment really in innovation of some kind, because that's the basis for the R&D.
Yeah, is there anybody from Empire State Development on this call?
No, they're too busy. They're too busy doing other things to listen to that. All right?
I'll leave that
Partially
one
by
there.
design.
I'll leave that one there, but super valid point, Martin, about public. I mean, that what they've invested in regionally over the last 10 years, that's publicly available data, which I think is a worthwhile pursuit, where I'm all for investing in upgrading Matt's Brewery in Utica, where economic development dollars go. But there's also a way to track, that independent variable to maybe some of what can be classified as independent. So, definitely a worthwhile pursuit.
One thing that's resonating with me, what you said, Mike, and I think actually gets back to that point we were talking about earlier of the differences between like PPC and ACV, is the mobility of people. Right, a true innovation economy, you're likely going to see high growth in employees, and likewise mobility of people between companies. And that, I mean, just sort of anecdotally in my experience, is usually an indicator of a growing, vibrant ecosystem. So to what extent, well, one, could that be validated, but two, could that be leveraged to start looking at factors around that, including culturally, would be interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'm at the same time looking to what you said, Mike, which was research from 25 years ago. Maybe I'm a little late to the party with that.
Well, it's been, I mean, that research has been going on for decades, right? But I think it's an interesting problem. I mean, I'm skewed because I've both researched it from top down as a researcher and published in social network analysis and did all that, but then also went to other countries and grew communities. And so I think there's a reality to it that the data is not necessarily going to pull out from the top, that you could get from the bottom up. And there's a lot of selection that goes on in networks. As an example, one I use for James all the time is that there's real deals, people that are in it, and they smell bullshit, and they tend to disconnect at certain times and certain places within these communities, where when you have people like Joe that was mentioned, or other people that are community connectors, what can often get and this is in the research as well, underweighted is the influence of individuals on those communities, right? That the impact of that individual in building the community gets lost in the actual community, and the weight that individual carries in that community, or even small group of individuals in that community can get lost in that, and that potentially could lead to more of a causal link in that chain by being much more, I don't know, in why these things are happening. And one thing that I haven't seen too much of that might be interesting is just behavioral data, because my experience is that is probably more determinant than other things. The people, buying into the other people at a very raw, behavioral, believable, trusting level, right? Especially in these communities that you're talking about, where everything's so fragile and early in its development. So like a bottom-up SNA stuff, old school SNA type stuff, where you gather the data is possible, as opposed to looking towards the data sources that may require all of that filtering. seems doable given just even the people on the screen, right, as a start.
It's a great suggestion, Mike. Absolutely. I think there's different ways to cut it. We're currently creating a BS detector through data, but I don't think anyone's perfected it quite yet. But I think I agree with you. I think there's a ton of potential there where it's definitely food for thought. I was just going to make a recommendation. I'm looking at the time as well. Maybe it's just to David or Martin or James. That type of thinking, or can we put out an open call to the mortgage jobs community, or maybe the UVC community, or whomever? I know we had some colleagues from Oregon who may not be with us today, had some great ideas from our last call. But can we put out an open call for research ideas similar to what Mike suggested and what some others, Martin with economic development, and maybe get maybe a list going of what's doable and what can be done heading into the new year? Would that be doable?
By all means, but let me offer up on the More Good Jobs community, we actually do have a channel that we hope to try to get a little activity that is about research, and maybe posting and trying to get even people that are on this call to post a comment or two so we can get some traction on that channel and let the asynchronous approach for some of this communication at least help build up a mini community who has this interest in the research side. And then that can build as we get some activity on that channel, then schedule our next event and using the people that are visiting that online channel as an avenue to get some participation.
I think it's under topics. See, there's topics, and you might want to rename that job research and stats. Well, maybe community building research or something. But when you post, you just sort of tag a topic. That's how it usually works. And I will absolutely contribute to all of them. I would just say, like, don't feel like you need to formalize that. Like, just if you have an idea, just put it out there. And it's you guys have had enough experience with this community. We're a pretty informal group of misfits, and they will respond as such, as will I. So I look forward to it. I love more chatter.
Yeah.
Every once in a while we get a pretty good thread going. So.
And if we don't have the right title for that channel, then let's retitle it.
Yeah. I just changed the title right now to Community Research and Stats. I think that fits a little better.
Okay. We'll run with it for now. Works for me.
Brett and Jason, work for you?
Yeah, it works good.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So James, make it happen.
Yeah. David's doing it as we speak, I believe, right?
All right.
Cool.
Yeah, I just changed the title of it right now.
Look at that.
Wait.
All right.
Get it done.
I got to run.
Okay.
Thanks
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks all. Appreciate the support.
See you.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.